Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you today to the fourth panel of the Tiergartenkonferenz on corporate security in Africa. The Tiergartenkonferenz is an annual international policy and security conference staged by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Since 2012, international experts and policy decision makers have been getting together to discuss and analyze strategic issues and to develop progressive options for action. In international politics, and that has become more evident during the times of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been witnessing an increased rivalry between global powers and the return to the pursuit of narrow national interests. The term of cooperative security is much associated with the Cold War Europe. However, the underlying logic is already deeply entrenched in other regions in the world. Today, we have gathered here to take a closer look at the state of cooperative security in Africa. The African Union was founded in 2002, replacing the Organization of African Unity. After the traumatic experience of the genocide in Rwanda and the civil war in Somalia, where intervention in the internal affairs of other states were impossible, the principle of non-interference was reinforced by the principle of non-indifference. The EU member states took the decision to no longer stand by while conflicts break out and spill over to entire regions. The African Union member states took the decision to no longer stand by. The African Constitutive Act is the first international treaty which includes the right to humanitarian intervention into another state. The founding protocol of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union can be seen as the founding protocol of the APSA. And it provides the Peace and Security Council with a broad mandate in preventing and dealing with conflict. The African peace and security architecture is especially tasked to cooperate also with the regional economic communities in Eastern, Western, Southern, and Central Africa to address crises and conflicts. Almost 20 years after its inception, the African peace and security architecture, on paper at least, resembles a prime example of a collective security mechanism, but its track records are rather mixed. While it has responded well to some conflict situations, it failed to work in other instances. Sometimes instruments were not functioning properly or mechanisms were not adhered to. In recent years, the African peace and security architecture was also sidelined by other actors. Increasingly, trans-regional and non-traditional security challenges, like on other continents too, were responded to by so-called coalitions of the willing. This was the case in the pursuit of the Lord's Resistance Army in East Africa and the fight against Islamic insurgents in the Sahel, but also in the fight against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad region. The African Standby Force was declared as combat ready in 2016, but has so far not been deployed. Our panel today will look at the different forms of cooperative security in Africa. We want to find out what challenges the collective security arrangement in the context of the APSA faces and how these can be addressed. Can these ad hoc coalitions and their international support be seen as a challenge to the collective security architecture on the African continent? Or can these be reconciled with the African peace and security architecture through reforms and adaptations? My colleague Philipp Goldberg, the director of the FES Peace and Security Competence Center based in Dakar, Senegal, will first give us some short technical remarks and then also introduce us to our panelists. Thank you very much, Philipp.
Thank you very much, Uli, and a wonderful good morning from Dakar. First of all, I would like to start with some housekeeping. Dear participants and viewers, the live stream format of this event limits the interaction of you with the panel. Yet participants who have registered in advance via the FES homepage can also now register for the chat, and I want to encourage you to do so. However, there are some practical points to consider. To be able to read and use the chat, users have to register for it with a freely selected username. While the live stream is available in English, German, and French, there's only one chat for all language versions. You may, of course, raise questions and make comments in all languages provided in the live stream. However, if you want to interact with other viewers through the chat, it is highly recommended to do so in English. Whereas the discussion starts among the panelists, at a later stage, we will take up questions and comments from the chat. The complete video of the panel discussion will be available afterwards. The chat will not be published, but be saved for documentary purposes. Only selected and not attributed comments and questions may be included in the subsequent conference report. Some final requests for the chat. We are looking forward to constructive questions and comments related to the topic of this panel. On the other hand, we are not tolerating personal offenses, calls for violence, sexist, discriminatory, extremist or racist postings, or links to websites that offer such content. We also do not accept advertising and spam, links to websites not related to the theme of the debate, or revelation of personal data. Our editorial team is tasked to monitor the chat for violations of these rules and might delete respective posts and block users if necessary. Thank you very much. And without no further ado, I will introduce our speaker of this morning's session, Mr. Christoph Matschie, member of the Deutsche Bundestag. Christoph Matschie dedicates his second time as member of Parliament of the German foreign policy to the German foreign policy with a special focus on Africa. In the ongoing legislative period, he's a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Deputy Speaker of the Working Group on Foreign Affairs of the Social Democratic Parliamentary Group. Also, he leads the Working Group on Africa within the Social Democratic Parliamentary Group. From 2004 until 2017, he held a seat in the Thuringian Parliament. From 2009 until 2014, he was Deputy Prime Minister in Thuringia and Minister of Education, Science and Culture. From 2002 to 2004, as a Member of Parliament, he had several functions. Among others, he was Parliamentary State Secretary for the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Thank you very much for being here, Christoph, and I will continue to introduce our panelists. I will start with Professor Dr. Ulf Engel. Ulf Engel is Professor of Politics in Africa at the Institute of African Studies at Leipzig University in Germany. He is also a visiting professor at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, and a professor extraordinary in the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Since 2006, he's advising the African Union's Peace and Security Department on issues of early warning, conflict prevention, and preventative diplomacy. Thank you very much for being here, Ulf, and welcome on this panel. I will continue with Dr. Katharina Döring. Katharina Döring is a researcher at the Center for Baltic and East European Studies at Södertörn University, Stockholm. She works on competing geopolitical projects in the military and security sector in Africa. She's part of the research group Continentalism, Geopolitics, and the idea of big space political formations in comparative historical perspective that brings together studies from Africa, Eurasia, Europe, and Latin America. She received her PhD from Leipzig University, and currently she is authoring a book on African military politics in the Sahel. Thank you very much for being here, Ms. Döring. Good morning. And last but not least, I would like to introduce to you Abdi Aynte. Abdi Aynte is the former Minister for Planning and International Cooperation in Somalia, and a board member of the Heritage Institute for Policy Studies, a think tank in Somalia. Mr. Aynte is widely published commentator and analyst of the Horn of Africa and has been journalist for 12 years working with the BBC, Voice of America, and Al Jazeera English. He holds a BA in journalism and an MA in political science from the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. Very, very thankful that you could make it this morning, Mr. Aynte, and welcome on this panel. And I give back to you, Uli. Thank you.
Thank you, Philipp. I think I would like to ask Christoph Matschie to give us an opening statement. And yeah, Christoph, thank you very much for taking your time and being here with us today.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Uli, and thank you, Philipp, for the kind introduction. I want to thank the Friedrich Ebert Foundation first for setting up this panel on collective security in Africa. I think it's a highly important and timely topic. Now in the next couple of minutes, I want to share with you some thoughts on collective security, and let me elaborate 5 points. First, the continent faces some changing security challenges. The international order is crumbling, and with it, the multilateral system. Geopolitical competition between the US and China becomes the new defining feature of global affairs. Consequently, we see a new scramble for Africa, where various actors jostle for influence on the continent. The young population strives for socio-economic opportunities. If governments cannot offer these opportunities, we will face growing political pressure or even radicalization, as we see in the Sahel. The COVID-19 pandemic will probably negatively affect the economic outlook for many countries and act as an accelerator for the above-mentioned socio-economic challenges. Last but not least, climate change combined with population growth acts as another trigger for destabilization and insecurity. Again, current developments in the Sahel come to mind. My second point, all these security challenges call for collective action. Not least because most states on the continent are smaller states, whilst most of the challenges do not stop at nation border. So the argument for collective security arrangements is crystal clear. Third, whilst the development of the African peace and security architecture, APSA, of the AU has been impressive, since its inception in 2002, APSA still faces various and formidable challenges. Let me just highlight 2 of them. First, a lack of own resources. External development partners fund 72% of the AU regular budget, and when considering only the peace support operation budget, the percentage rises to 95%. And second, the further development or institutionalization of APSA is challenged by conflicting political interests. Some AU member states are not willing to hand over sovereignty to the AU and APSA. And in some cases, there is a tug of war between the AU and the regional economic communities about who should be in the lead when facing particular security challenges. My 4th point, political trust is the precondition for any kind of collective security arrangement. And as we can see in our European history, giving up national sovereignty in the field of security is most difficult for nation states and therefore often comes last in a development. Economic and political integration are probably preconditions for closer security integration. I think the Agenda 2063 and the Continental Free Trade Zone are very encouraging signs that might pave the way for creating trust between states. And this trust might allow for building a more effective collective security architecture. Final point, such a development will take time. Germany and the EU have a great interest in the successful development of APSA, because, as I mentioned earlier, Europe's security depends on Africa's security. But in order to empower APSA, we have to be in for the long game. At the same time, however, African and European states face more short-term security challenges. Think of terrorism in the Sahel. And these challenges have to be dealt with a rather short notice. When APSA is not yet ready to handle these kind of scenarios, we will probably rely on ad hoc coalitions in the future too. Obviously, there is a certain contradiction between a long-term interest of an effective APSA and the short-term interest of tackling immediate security challenges as we do in the Sahel. And this is a challenge for policymakers. We need to try to bring these different interests as closely aligned as possible. This might not be easy, but this makes it even more important to have a frank discussion on how to get there. Therefore, I'm thankful for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for organizing this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the debate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for those opening words, and also your plea that Germany or the European side also has to stay involved with the African peace and security architecture, but on the other hand, also that Africa has to find a way to especially deal with some of the short-term security challenges. If we read about APSA, we also read about Professor Ulf Engel. He is one of the big names and the big researchers, has been working with, about, and for the African Union. So you're very welcome, Professor Ulf Engel. Thank you for being with us here today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. Please, Professor Engel, can you introduce us what is the general state of the African peace and security architecture and what kind of cooperative security arrangement it resembles? Also, moreover, has APSA managed so far to deal with peace and security challenges since its inception, and especially what has been happening in the last years?
Well, much has already been said by the Honorable MP on what APSA is all about. I mean, it dates back to 2002 and the protocol relating to the establishment of the Peace and Security Council. And in those days, it was an ambitious plan to create a security arrangement around the PSC, the Peace and Security Council, the Panel of the Wise, the African Standby Force, which is made up of 5 regional brigades, the Continental Early Warning System, QS, and a peace fund. By now, most of these institutions are working quite well, yet there are still deficits when it comes to arrangements in North Africa and in Central Africa. And with regard to your question about how far APSA has managed to deal with peace and security challenges, I will not go into details, or the technical details, but let me put it this way. Regular evaluations of the African Union and the APSA have repeatedly shown room for improvement, although over time the Union has managed to become more efficient and professional. Yet at the same time, I guess there's huge potential to improve even further, especially in 3 areas which I would like to highlight briefly. First is about the creation of a distinct mediation architecture and the integration of the various instruments and actors in a more efficient way. This includes today revitalizing the largely dormant Panel of the Wise and PANWISE, the Pan-African Network of Mediators. Second, it's about integrating better the APSA and the complementary African governance architecture, AGA. And thirdly, it's about investing more efforts in long-term structural conflict prevention.
Okay, thank you very much. You were talking about the the integration of the African peace and security architecture together with the African governance architecture. What exactly does that mean, and what would we expect if such two bodies are integrated well?
Mm. The African governance architecture is based on a document that was adopted in 2007 and became effective in 2012, which is the African Charter on Democracy, Governance and Elections. And this is a set of international values and practices around organizing elections and improving governance structures in countries, including a reporting mechanism. So far, the ABSA and the AGA are dealt with in separate departments of the EU Commission. And with the institutional reform process that is ongoing, the two will be merged next summer. So there will be a department for political affairs, peace and security. And this is one of the major game changers, I suppose, to have a more integrated, streamlined policy that looks both at upcoming potential risks for violent conflict around, let's say, elections or unconstitutional changes of government, up to the important violent cases that we've seen so far. And mentioning the institutional reform is not just about the merger of these two departments, which is important, but they're also introducing a principle of rotation by gender and region when it comes to the important positions within the Commission. So far, the portfolio of peace and security has been in the hands of Algeria since its inception in 2004. Now, this might, or definitely will be changing as of next summer. And there's a third element, quite technical, being introduced in the department, which is a new organigram and the organization of desks following a regional principle as opposed to a theme-driven one, which is just in line with the United Nations. The challenge here will be to create a workflow between those desks that is capable of addressing the cross-border nature of violent conflict in Africa. If you think of the Saharan region or the Horn of Africa or the Lake Chad Basin.
So how exactly can we expect that those new threats, which are mostly transnational in nature and also less away from affecting single states? I mean, how does this reform exactly, how is it planning to respond to those challenges, to better deal with it?
Well, first of all, the institutional reform is not really meant to address the issue of violent conflict, but the efficiency of the African Union. And so some of the changes not necessarily may have a direct effect on the ongoing coordination processes when it comes to response options in those areas mentioned. And definitely the whole question of the mediation architecture needs an overhaul and a more systematic integration and policy coordination. The integration of ABSA and AGA is not just an administrative issue, but it's highly political and calls for coordination in practice. There certainly is more room for improvement when it comes to long-term structural prevention, although the instruments for that are already in place, in particular when it comes to country structural vulnerability and resilience assessments and related mitigation strategies. The whole question of the division of labor between the AU and the RECs is now being debated next month. As far as I know, there will be a new memorandum of understanding replacing the 2008 memorandum governing the cooperation and how the principle of subsidiarity will be applied in future. And in the end of the day, I suppose the PSC protocol itself, with all its instruments and mandates, need a thorough revision too.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Engel. I mean, you've already talked about the interaction between the African Union and the regional economic communities, which is SADC, APSA, East African Unity, and others. So how does it look like? I very often hear about so-called competition between those different bodies. Where does it come from, this competition, and how does, for instance, a new memorandum of understanding, how can it solve this problem?
This competition dates back to the origins of the RECs, I suppose. Most of them are, or have been established in the late 1970s, have been revived in the 1990s, before the AU existed. And in the old days, there was the idea of African integration through the RECs as building blocks. And with the PSC protocol, this has been turned upside down. Basically, the AU is now a structure to coordinate the RECs. This has been accepted by some of the RECs more than by others. And then, of course, proximity brings it with it that ECOWAS, for example, may be better situated to respond to developments in Gambia, Mali, you name it, in previous cases. There is sometimes debate about what the best approach could be, and that has played out more so between the AU and ECOWAS than with any other member state or member REC. There's a different kind of division of labor between the AU and the Southern African Development Community, which is enjoying more leeway and has seen more tasks delegated to SADC in the past. This is slightly changing recently, in particular with the events in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique and the new attention of the African Union towards that region. I'm not sure what the political mechanisms will be in the new Memorandum of Understanding to better coordinate and harmonize the AU and the RECs. At the working level, this is being done in certain areas quite well in the last 10 years, if you think of early warning and conflict prevention. But what is also clear is that the, you call it ad hoc mechanisms, have gained more prominence. And most importantly, I think this is due to, or that refers to the so-called Nouakchott, Djibouti, and Yaoundé processes, whereby the African Union is trying to coordinate different actors and share intelligence in regions that cut across the original African regions. So let's say between ECAS and ECOWAS.
Thank you very much. You talked about that it would be very necessary and timely to build up and improve a mediation mechanism. I mean, on papers or in the documents, these are there already, I guess. So how are they functioning? What are they using? We hear, especially I think in the West African region, there is a lot of mediation going on, like the recent coups in Mali, the coups in Gambia. So what needs to be improved? What's the most necessary stages on that improvement?
If you think of the instruments of the African Union, most importantly, you have a number of special envoys, high representatives, dealing with either country-based conflicts or cross-country issues. To start with, there is no coordination mechanism and no briefing mechanism among those mediators and the Commissioner of Peace and Security or the chairperson of the Commission, save for an annual meeting. But there's no systematic lessons learned, best practice exercises, no debriefing. The special envoys do not have a budget on their own. They are understaffed and pretty much relying on host governments. Second instrument, the panel of the wise, that used to play an important role, let's say between 2008 and 2012, has been sidelined under the current commission, is not efficiently being used, and needs to be revived and strengthened, I guess, with its own budget as well. there's different experience with regard to international contact groups that the AU is coordinating in cases of unconstitutional changes of government. Some of them have been fairly efficient. If you think of Madagascar, despite the long time that it took to bring back the country after the coup d'etat in 2009 to elections in 2016. And then there is the whole question of entry points for collaborative mediation, cooperation between the, let's say, special envoys of the African Union and those of ECOWAS, or the UN special representatives of the Secretary General. That is something that is often depending on personalities rather than on systematic planning and structures.
Hey, thank you. So I think it's much about, what I hear is much about institutionalizing and following some rules and regulations and procedures practically when we talk about mediation and the use of the panel and the wise and other structures. Maybe before we go to the next panelist, one last question for now. How come the regional economic communities could not cope with some of those threats in recent years? When we talk about when a number of countries joined to pursue the Lord's Resistance Army, or like we look at the multinational joint task force in northern Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin, or recently the G5 actually fighting terrorists or terrorism in the Sahel region. Why didn't some of the existing RECs, regional economic communities, not take on that task? Because they've done it before.
That's a good question. I guess there are a couple of answers to that. One thing is, has already been mentioned by the Honorable MP, that is the changing nature of violent conflict. When we look at hybrid warfare or cyber warfare and things like that, the traditional instruments of mediation and so on are overwhelmed. Many of the interventions, both military and non-military, have in the past not addressed the root causes of conflict, so intervention came fairly late in the lines. Those interventions usually do not address the precarious political economy of these conflicts. And if you just think of the coup d'etat in Mali recently, in the building up of that situation, we had a situation by which some of the state military actors actually colluded with some of the so-called terrorists and violent extremists. So there is, local structures are heavily involved in the organization of violent conflict and are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And if you just think of the way that the Nigerian army is fighting Boko Haram, which is now being copied by the way that the Mozambicans are fighting in Cabo Delgado, this is clearly not helping at all. We're talking about gross human rights violations, lack of strategy and integration, and for many years also a lack of interest in the spillover effects into neighboring countries.
Okay, thank you very much, Ulf Engel. So I think it becomes very clear also that these coalitions of the willing, they have severe shortcomings. I mean, although they can respond relatively fast and robust in some instances, when it comes to legitimacy on the one hand, but also to human rights and other issues, they definitely do not fulfill I think the standards that many of us would like to see. Dr. Katharina Döring is a researcher at the Center for Baltic East of European Studies. You're very welcome. Thank you very much for being with us here. do these ad hoc coalition, which we can see right now also in the Sahel region, do they portray a loss of confidence of African head and states, and also in some cases of their European partners in the problem-solving capabilities of existing structures such as ECOWAS or the African Union's peace and security architecture?
I would pose the question differently. I would say it is rather a show of politics that are very vital and that we are maybe more aware of now than we used to be, that the African peace and security architecture, that the African Union, everything we are talking about, sometimes, especially when I talk to people from the humanities in the academic community, they say, oh, you have so many acronyms. What are these things? They are only tools. And what is it? No, there are people, there are political interests, there are governments behind that. And I think we need to realize that. And I think in particular when it comes to the G5 Sahel and the situation we are seeing now in the Sahel with so many different mechanisms and actors, we need to acknowledge that there are politics at play and there are agency. Christoph Matschie noticed in one of his 5 points, the first one, the geopolitical playing of China and Russia. And I think we have misread for a long time that there's geopolitical visions by all actors involved. And then when you look at Idriss Déby of Chad, he has very particular ideas about how to organize security in the Sahel and others too. So this is what is important to stress. So we cannot say so easily it's a loss of confidence, but rather there is a bigger playing field now. And on that point, I would like just to open a bit up the context for the G5 Sahel, because it has come up, and I think it is something very visible right now. Where did the G5 Sahel come from? That's also a question we need to understand. And if we roll back, not to the last coup, 1 month, but to the coup 2012 and to the developing situation in Mali, we saw that ECOWAS reacted very quickly, as now as well. ECOWAS got involved very soon with mediation in the coup, but ECOWAS also got involved in response to the security situation. ECOWAS proposed to deploy the ECOWAS standby force already in April 2012. And it was from that on that ECOWAS proposed the force, MISEMA, ECOWAS mission to Mali, in order to deal with the armed violence in the north of the country. It was again rejected again and again by the United Nations Security Council, who did not want to give a mandate for that. Of course, there were problems with logistics, with a proper exit strategy, and there was a lot of technical problems that were valuable. But we see the same technical problems now with the G5 Sahel Joint Force. But apparently with the G5 Sahel Joint Force, the so-called donor and partner countries were still willing to give money, which they were not willing to give to an ECOWAS force. And also, as throughout 2012, ECOWAS force was transformed into an African Union force, which eventually deployed. That was January 2013. When the French deployed, also the African Union and ECOWAS together deployed the force. So this is the sort of background where we had regional actors, local actors willing to engage on a much broader scale, but they were not supported in that quest. And then when it comes to the establishment of the G5 Sahel as a regional organization in 2014, we need to remember that actually the African Union Commission before had understood how important it is to bring in all the neighboring countries of Mali when they started the Nouakchott process, which was a very inclusive process that also included Algeria, Nigeria, had 11 countries from the wider region, connected the conflict dynamics we see in Mali also to that of Libya, and was a more comprehensive approach, but that did not receive much support. And we need to ask ourselves, really honestly, what have European partners been doing when they're propping up the G5 Sahel since years, which is frankly undermining the integration process that ECOWAS has been part of since, well, more like 30 years now. And as the previous speaker, as Ulf noted, this economic integration, the long-term integration in the region, There are lots of cross-border social integration that is there by default because people communicate their trade in an informal level. So ECOWAS has actually on a formal level really driven this region. And now we are having a new regional organization that is attracting funding, which is detrimental to that. Maybe as an opening statement. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Katharina. I mean, we've observed in these ad hoc coalitions that, I mean, they all were afterwards authorized by the African Union. And also that, for instance, in the case of the G5 Sahel, that they actually signed a memorandum of understanding with ECOWAS in July 2018. I mean, in the case of G5 Sahel, is there, I mean, how do you see the cooperation between G5 Sahel and ECOWAS? Is there meaningful cooperation? Has the memorandum of understanding actually been put into place or implemented?
As I see it, I wouldn't say that there's significant cooperation. There is an increased communication now. And what you said, the endorsement by the African Union also of the G5 Sahel Joint Force, in the process, due process, like there was due process. The African Union Peace and Security Council endorsed the Joint Force, then it was handed over also to the United Nations Security Council. So that was a process that was kept, and the Peace and Security Council again and again stressed that the G5 Sahel Joint Force is also part of APSA, already alluding that APSA is changing, that APSA is trying to accommodate for these ad hoc coalitions. So that has definitely taken place. There is more communication now and efforts to at least coordinate, but this is very different. And then there's one issue I want to highlight here, which is the staff capacities. When you look at how many bureaucrats at the European Union Commission in Brussels are busy working on the G5 Sahel issues and the capacities you have actually in Nouakchott at the headquarters, and then measure that against the capacities you have in Abuja at the ECOWAS Commission, where people are concerned with a lot of things, and now they also have to think about this coordination. There are sometimes very, very day-to-day things where this cannot happen. I actually remember talking to one of the people involved at the ECOWAS Commission, who was trying to have early on a cooperation with the G5 Sahel, even before it was widely spoken about, even before the Memorandum of Understanding. But it was simply not possible to participate in the meetings because he was busy with other things. It wasn't possible to get, a simply matter as getting the right tickets and getting it confirmed by the Commission that he could go. And these are very technical, everyday challenges which make this ideal of cooperation very difficult. And then comes the political problems that we have with the G5 Sahel that it has stirred up. Because these mechanisms are political. Who do you include? Who do you exclude? Who is part of it? So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So could one say that this ratification in a way of this ad hoc coalition, like we could interpret the actions of the African Union, is that does that show us where the African peace and security architecture will be moving in the near future?
It is certainly a reality, and it is wanted. These coalitions are wanted. Also, the multinational joint task force against Boko Haram, the MNJTF, when it was reformed, reintroduced in 2015, Nigeria could have opted for a more ECOWAS-based solution, but they didn't want that. And this also has to do with national interests when it comes to the militaries. Where do you send your troops? Who is paying for your troops? How can you control the troops? When you have an international mission under the African Union, you have different regulations, the human rights frameworks that you have to comply to, which make things way more difficult. And that is still this ongoing tension also between the member states. How much if you want to call it sovereignty or responsibility or control do they want to give up? So the ad hoc coalitions are here to stay. The question is, how can we deal with them and how can they be fruitfully used within APSA? And in that sense, I think APSA needs to evolve. And I think right now, all the engaged actors. And for me, APSA is something very broad. We are now part of APSA because we are discussing it and we are shaping it and part of the discourses surrounding it. And it needs to be understood that it's not a tool that we can apply. It is something constantly changing. But I think just leaving it behind and saying we're just doing ad hoc coalitions now will not help, because APSA has actually built a lot of capacities, especially when it comes to the African Standby Force, that may not be able to react so much to counterterrorism operatives. But it has trained military towards certain standards, also when it comes to human rights issues, but also managed to form a cooperation between these militaries. People from Nigeria, soldiers from Benin training together and building slowly this sort of regional understanding and communication on that level, and is also a part of integration. So that's why important to transform APSA, but still work within that further.
Thank you very much, Katharina. Thank you very much for giving us an insight in the political economy behind, I think all those different security arrangements. I mean, it's really worth asking, is the African peace and security architecture then questioning its foundation of being a collective security organization? If it mandates, employs maybe in future such ad hoc coalitions, which can very be questions in terms of legitimacy or also broad support sometimes. Thank you very much. Mr. Abdi Aynte. So are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think maybe let's move to the other side of Africa, to the eastern or the Horn of Africa, where you are also very familiar with. I mean, we have big peace support operations with of the African Union in Sudan, but also in Somalia, and they're soon running out. So what are we to expect in future? Is the African Union also authorizing, letting such coalitions doing the work, or what are we to expect?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I think it's important to say that in terms of the missions that are now in Somalia and in Sudan, they've done remarkably well over the past decade and a half, which they've been around, both of them. And I think Sudan was slightly longer than Somalia. But the fact of the matter is that they've done remarkably well by supporting government institutions and keeping the peace, but also in the context of Somalia fighting Al-Shabaab and so on and so forth. I think their initial intervention really is a reflection of the initial APSA spirit. The spirit of APSA was to create a collective security arrangement in the African Union context. And that initial deployment of Somalia back in 2007 was a reflection of that. And you could see how successful the mission was in the first, I would say, 7 years of its lifespan. But now it's at a critical juncture where it's been around for far too long, longer than most people would have hoped for. And there are now questions about its longer-term viability for both political and practical reasons. I think the political reasons are far more important, and they speak to the topic in discussion today, which is the collective security arrangement or cooperative security arrangement in Africa in the context of APSA. First, I think what you see in both AMISOM and in the case of Sudan is missions that are increasingly being influenced by the interests of member states. Naturally, the neighboring countries to both Somalia and Sudan are trying to extend their influence, and they're now becoming a lot more important than the cooperative security arrangement itself. And then the practical element is that issues of the financial burden that comes with these missions is now becoming impractical year after year. I mean, the EU cutting 20% of AMISOM, the US looking at options. It's actually becoming untenable in the coming few years. And it speaks to the fundamental challenge that APSA has, which is that as much as you can put together a cooperative and collective security arrangement, you need to be able to support it with the power of the purse. You need to have the financial envelope behind it, which the African continent seems to be lacking at this point in time.
Thank you very much. So there seems to be quite a competition then, I guess, between those different security arrangements. And as you also highlighted, is that it's a question of funding very often. I mean, we've heard from Christoph Matschie that 95% of the peace budgets of the African Union comes from outside funding. And yeah, but do you see, I mean, you already mentioned that the influence of neighboring countries in countries like Somalia and Sudan have become very obvious. So will they form coalitions amongst themselves to continue their narrow national interest in a way?
Well, the only thing is that their own national interests are not aligned. In the context of Somalia, you have Ethiopia and Kenya, whose national interests vis-a-vis Somalia are simply not aligned. And that is leading them to essentially compete rather than cooperate in peacekeeping terms, and essentially advance national interests and geostrategic interests and try to shape the domestic politics of the country one way or the other. So the problem, I think, is more acutely felt in Somalia rather than in Sudan. Now, you do see in other contexts some countries forming, ad hoc coalitions to advance perhaps a regional, regional interest or whatever. But I think, the more you leave the cooperative security arrangement that was agreed among the African countries in the form of APSA, the likelihood that you will see less cooperation among the African countries, because the point of APSA was to bring member states together on a collective security interest. And now it's facing two fundamental challenges. One is political, in that their national interests are not always aligned and there is no common value that is bringing them together. There is a common value written on a document, but in practical sense, we have no common value. And then the other challenge is a financial one, as I spoke about earlier.
Thank you. So the African Union has planned to reform itself in 2019. President Paul Kagame has been tasked to lead this transformation process. Will that help us to deal with these basic contradictions between the politically opportune and the collective security arrangement that APSA calls itself and wants to be on paper? Can we expect a solution to that problem?
I mean, it's almost a dichotomy, a paradox, if you think about it in that sense. The paradox is that on the one hand, the African Union leadership is trying to do the right thing by always trying to explore ways to find a common ground and to reform its collective and cooperative security frameworks, such as APSA and AGA and others. And as Professor Ulf was saying earlier, even an attempt to merge the two together and create a much more dynamic document. But then on the other hand, the other side of the paradox is that I've always argued that the absence of a common value system that binds together. And here, one needs to draw on the example of the European Union. As much as they are, 27 or 28 member states that are neighbors, they are joined together by a very strong foundational value system that they can hold each other accountable, and they try to hold each other accountable for the most part. In the African context, still, sovereignty is being weaponized in ways that you cannot imagine. In that, if the continent itself tries to utilize it as a cooperative and collective security arrangement, or tries to hold one of its own member states accountable, the sovereignty kicks in, and you would see examples all over where coups have taken place, and maybe there's a statement or two, and then we're back to normal business. So I think as long as we are weak on the strong value system, I'm not very optimistic about a strong cooperative and collective security arrangement.
Okay, thank you very much. So that is not a very, very good view in the future. So maybe Professor Engel, sorry, do you have a view on that? I mean, how do we deal with this contradiction in a way? How does the African Union get out of this, find a solution, or find its way to deal, effectively with African security threats?
First of all, I do very much agree with Abdi's analysis. And I think it's a matter of perspective, time perspective that one takes on this issue. There are very few compliance mechanisms, but they are important also with regard to democracy and to security. The most important one, in my view, is the compliance mechanism with the African Charter on Democracy. Member states every 2 years should report to the AU Commission on the domestication of common values in national legislation. This is not really happening. The first country to do so was Togo, November 2017, and has been the only country thus far. Now, with the institutional reforms of the African Union, new compliance mechanisms are being introduced, and member states have committed themselves to add on the governance reporting, which is already in place. We will see how this is working. It's incremental change, very slow, and it draws attention to the fact that we're talking not about a united continent in this respect, but these countries are different, with different interests, with different, let's say, quality of governance and democracy in place. But there is now an interest to bring together the revived African peer review mechanism, which is going with NIPAD, and early warning and governance issues together. So in future, one could foresee a situation that there is a small coalition of the willing and the able emerging when it comes to questions of governance that join forces in reporting. I think it was very encouraging that Ghana in 2017-18 has been the first member state to go through the process of this continental structural vulnerability assessment and resilience assessment. Currently, a new mission is being prepared for another member countries, and some few others have queued to become part of that. So I could imagine a situation that after the elections for commission positions early next year, so within the next half year, nothing will happen. But after that, that a new momentum could be created to bring together a small number of states that really live up to the shared values that do exist on paper, as Abdi rightly said. And then it's a matter of how big this coalition will be. At one point in time, it will work like everything else. Others will have to follow, although they don't believe in it.
Mm. Okay, that means that you talked of a coalition of the willing in terms of democratic values and reporting and self-regulation. I find that very interesting. I mean, there's this discussion very often that are we or when are we going to see a new generation of African leaders or African governments that is more actively and is more has more common values. And what do you think about the discussion? Are we seeing, I mean, as you mentioned, Ghana, Togo, some of those examples, is there light in the end of the tunnel concerning those self-regulation mechanisms?
Well, on that one, I would be careful. I remember the last discussion about the new African leaders that was in 1996, and it was coined by some American political scientists with regard to Kagame, Meles, and other people. And there is a contradiction, of course, that people who lead authoritarian countries at the same time produce some momentum for introducing substantive reforms to the African Union and also to the value architecture that is around. So it have been authoritarian regimes actually contributed quite strongly to the important instruments that we have in place nowadays. If you think of the policy script around unconstitutional changes of government, that debate was started in 1996-7 by Robert Mugabe. Now we see a similar thing coming from Paul Kagame and from Abdi and other people. So in this respect, there is a commitment by some of the leaders, I wouldn't call them new leaders, but some of the leaders who have an understanding that you can only survive collectively vis-a-vis not only the local challenges of violent extremism, terrorism, but also all the rough interventions, be it the US, the Chinese, the Russians, the Turkish government, and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Katharina, where do you see the chance of the survival of this sort of collectiveness, this collective security principles, especially if you look at the interface between the governance architecture and the security architecture?
I think I would stress another point. Ulf was highlighting the importance of political leadership, which also includes the presidents and the kind of dynamics going on there. I think I would highlight the bureaucrats at the commissions and all these sort of desk officers, people that actually make these policies work and implement them. And there you see, I would say, a sort of African cosmopolitan elite that is in this specific area kind of emerging, from the African Union Commission to the ECOWAS Commission to other regional organizations. But also people, when you look at their biographies and their professional biographies, how they rotate between different organizations, that they also work for UN agencies, they may work for one of the so-called partner organizations in the capitals, maybe of their countries, then they will maybe go back into national politics or into the ministries. There is, to a certain degree, a fluctuation. And I think this group of people is extremely important. When we look at the European Union Commission and the sheer number of people working there, the sheer workforce in order to follow up on decisions, in order to implement decisions. And these people are important because they are sort of also the loop back to the national level, because they have their national identities. And if there's a certain issue in emergencies, they will, of course, also rely on their personal networks within these nations, which can facilitate in a very positive way a sort of moving forwards when you have a formal level communication, but also these personal networks working. And I think this is increasingly important. And you have a lot of young, very competent, very capable professionals in these areas.
Okay, so you're practically talking about the self-image of these people actually working in those institutions who are driving also this process by being there. And then we know this discussion also from the European Union, where the clerks and the people working in the European Union are actually much more European than many of the member states where they come from sometimes.
And maybe that point, just because Abdi mentioned this very importance of shared values and norms. And when you talk to those people, there is really a shared sense of community, and we need to engage in this for.
Yes, Philipp, do we have any questions to our panelists from the audience?
Yes, we have a couple of questions received already, but please feel free to add towards the chat even more questions, as we still have a bit of time. The first question is, how is the title of the panel, Collective Security or Cooperative Security? Isn't there a difference? I think that's a bit of a broader question and a bit provocative, so I'll just put that into the group. And the second question is, are the regional economic communities even able to act in the area of collective security because of their differences within the organizations and differences between the regional economic communities? And related to that, another question towards regional economic communities: how are regional economic communities supposed to deal with situations like the oppression in Zimbabwe? To which extent is SADC supposed to intervene? And the fourth question is, I wonder if the Nigerian army should not fight against groups like Boko Haram because of human rights violations, etc. Who then should? So maybe I've just rephrased that. I think what was said is, I wonder if the Nigerian army should not fight against groups like Boko Haram because of human rights violations. Who should then fight, if not the Nigerian army itself? So these are the four questions we have received within the chat so far. And yeah, I'll maybe I would pose the first couple of questions because Ulf Engel, you've been talking a little bit about the regional economic communities earlier on. Maybe we can start with that and then continue towards the interventional forces of the case of Nigeria.
That's, the observation is quite correct, of course. The very idea that the African standby force with the 5 defined regions of Africa would be able to intervene has been proven quite wrong. We haven't seen a deployment yet. It was threatened, the deployment of 5,000 police person to Burundi in 2015 in the wintertime, hasn't been accepted by the Assembly. And the reasons for that are quite obvious. It's a political dispute within the regions. So it would be impossible for the East African standby force to be deployed in that part of the world. And for others. So the search for alternative intervention means has started right from the beginning, and we've seen a couple of those. Katharina has worked on that quite extensively. And of course, the outcome is ad hoc mechanisms, and we are now in a situation where we need to integrate those with the instruments and the mandates that the African unions and the RECs have given themselves. When it comes to the question of Boko Haram and Nigerian army, I would like to take a different example, the same issue basically. If you look at the way that Mozambique is trying to deal with the insurgency in Cabo Delgado, the northern province, you can see the kind of alternatives that are on the market. You bring in a Russian contractor, then you bring in a South African private military company, and because of sovereignty, because of a certain culture coming from the liberation movement and power, it took Mozambique quite some time to address that question within the SADC or the AU context. And it was only early this year that it was addressed by the African Union at the last SADC summit held in August this year. For the first time discussed the issue in a very generic, short way. And those who could intervene, external actors with an interest in the situation, so far have not really moved. Tanzania on the one hand and South Africa on the other. But South Africa, increasingly, we can see a debate in the country among security politicians and foreign politicians, foreign policy people, that South Africa is preparing for some or the other kind of intervention, which is partly, of course, not due to the conflict, but due to the fact that there are huge gas fields in the area where South Africa would like to tap into.
Okay, thank you very much, Ulf, for this comprehensive response. I would would like to come back to Ms. Döring. Maybe we can come back to the question about Nigeria in particular, because you've been arguing earlier on about the national responsibility as well as the regional forces, in particular the established structures such as the African Standby Force. Would the Nigerian army have a mandate to intervene against groups like Boko Haram who are violating human rights in certain areas of Nigeria?
Well, the Nigerian army is leading the fight against Boko Haram, and of course they're doing that, and they have some successes in it. But the problems are these gross human rights violations. The problems are the way the army has in certain areas been behaving, and this is something that needs to be addressed within a more continuous process of not only training the armies, but also making sure that they can adhere to these standards. But of course, when you actually, when you talk to Nigerian soldiers that were involved, they face a very, very difficult situation and context where they cannot always, in the missions, comply with all the regulations. And that brings us back to the question, who then should do it? And that was something, when the African Standby Force was established, that was actually discussed, because it was along this UN principle of having interveners that are not involved politically, that are distanced and that are more passive to the conflict. This ideal of saving strangers comes from that. But Williams once called it that on the African continent, you have the ideal of saving neighbors. So this is something that is more pronounced now when you have these regional coalitions of countries that are affected by the violence, sending their militaries. Probably these armies are good so far in doing the job and being the ones, because imagine that you would have now troops from South Africa or Tanzania fighting against Boko Haram. That was actually a proposal in 2015 that the so-called African Capacity for Immediate Response to Crisis should have been deployed to fight Boko Haram. No one wanted this, and not only for political reasons, but also because then there is a distrust that soldiers from far away would not also probably pry on the local population. That would also be a problem. So they're probably the right people already there, but the question is how to guide these military operations in such a way that we don't have this negative spillovers. And probably having them only military is one of the problems. There needs to be a higher multidimensionality in these troops that includes civilian components, police components.
Thank you very much for this answer. I would like to come back to Mr. Aynte. We've been talking earlier on a little bit about the financing of the APSA, as well as that most of the financing, Christoph Matschie pointed it out earlier on, is coming from external actors or donors. Would you foresee, from your perspective out of the East African region, an opportunity to strengthen financial resources from the African continent itself? And how could that work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's a central question to the whole discussion around the issue of common and collective security architecture and governance architecture as well, because you put your money where your mouth is. And I think there is a responsibility on the African countries and all of us to ensure that we are, to the extent we can, contributing to the security arrangements of our regions and of our countries as well. I think that will, in fact, will have a huge impact on the strengthening of APSA and other cooperative and collective security arrangements, because then it is almost financing like your own army. You would be given more duty of care and more responsibility and so on and so forth. I think there has been a number of discussions within the African Union on whether African countries are actually financially capable of paying for their own security. And a number of people tend to say that they're not. But I'm of the strong view that, in fact, African countries are already paying for their own security. They're already supporting their own armies and police and so on and so forth. I think by sending their own troops to other countries as part of a broader peacekeeping missions and still paying for their own interventions is not actually too much to ask. I think we need to have that very serious discussion at the high level, and I'm very encouraged to see that some of the reforms that are now being proposed by President Kagame and others are actually calling for increasing responsibility of the African Union in terms of the financial responsibilities. But I would just end very quickly here that the other element to this is the collective and common value system and shared value system. I think that very much goes in tandem with the financial aspect of things, and so I think we need to have that discussion as well alongside the one on financing peacekeeping missions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would maybe like to change the topic a little bit and come back to the opening speech of Christoph Matschie. And there's a question from the chat asking that Christoph Matschie mentioned the influence of climate change in combination with population growth on conflict and security. What challenges poses or will pose climate change to collective security in Africa and for the AU? And maybe we can stay in the Horn of Africa and then continue with the other panelists. Aynte, would you have a response to that question? Mr. Aynte, are you still there?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question? That was just.
I was coming back to Christoph Matschie's opening speech, and he mentioned the influence of climate change in combination with population growth on conflict and security. What challenges poses or will pose climate change to collective security in Africa and for the AU is one of the group chat members asking.
That's another excellent question. Climate change is actually already posing major challenges to African countries. It is not and has not been, unfortunately, a priority for most member states or even collectively, although now there's a great deal of discussion and recognition that global warming and climate change actually are part and parcel of, stability of the continent. One of the main reasons why climate change is a huge security challenge to the African continent in general, but more so to the more vulnerable countries, is that there is no strong infrastructure to respond to degradation of the environment and so on and so forth. I mean, we now see biggest countries in the world actually grappling and struggling with it. See what's happening in the US now, where there's wildfires and others. And so we're not very well equipped to deal with that. And there hasn't been a lot of domestic investments in each member states on global change, global warming and climate change. In fact, some countries like my own country do not even have dedicated ministries, which is quite tragic to deal with the issue of environment. It just tells you how the issue has not become a priority, policy priority for member states. Now, this is another important element to the whole climate change is it is more acutely felt in Africa also because most African countries continue to rely on agriculture and farming and livestock and related issues as main source of their living. And so the deterioration of the environment has a direct and a very deleterious impact on them as well.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can revert to another region of the continent, and we can go to the Sahel. Katharina Döring, may I ask the same question to you? Pose the same question to you. How does the demographic developments in the Sahel region, as well as climate change, influence the security agenda of the Sahel region? You looking extensively into the Sahel at the moment, what do you observe?
I think the fact that these topics are more widely spoken about now has also led to a re-remembering of organizations that have already been in place. When you look at the Autorité du Liptako Gourmand, that was an organization that was formed amongst many other organizations with a view to coordinate agricultural and climate issues in the border area between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, that is now being revived in the context of the G5 Sahel Joint Force with a more military, for this military cooperation. But also when you look at the Lake Chad Basin Commission, for example, when it comes to water resource management. So these organizations have been there, and actually in the 70s and 80s, they were already established. So when it comes to further development of APSA and really leveraging what is there, I think right now this is a moment where these organizations can be brought in again, and that would also broaden the scope where we look beyond military approaches to counterterrorism and actually remember again economic integration, this agricultural integration and cooperation between the countries, and the fora for these are there.
Thank you, Katharina. I have another question from the chat, and I would give it to Ulf first, and then we can maybe make it a round. Would you, or to what extent would you criticize the actions of the European Union and other global players in Africa?
That's a tough question. It's extremely broad, and of course you will find lots of entry points to answer that question, looking both at the United Nations and the European Union. But to start on a positive note, I guess both the United Nations and the European Union have been extremely important in helping the African Union and the RECs through the strategic partnerships that have been developed since 2007-8. And they are the most important support structures, despite all the different interests that member states may have. If you think of the P3 group of countries with their own interests in Africa, and the let's say interests or the conflict of interest between France and the European Union when it comes to the G5 process and the like. And you will be able to single out lots of other external actors who follow their own policies, of course. Now, just very quickly with regard to the last few comments on climate change, I think it's important to keep in mind that we are not just talking about new security threats in terms of violent extremism and terrorism. Increasingly, the African Union, since 2014, is discussing so-called non-traditional security threats. And climate change obviously being one of them, which is undermining resilience of societies rather than building structural stability of societies. Others to name is cybercrime, transnational organized crime, but of course in these days increasingly pandemics. The impact of Corona on peace and security is visible. And just to give a short, very small example, if you think of the UN stabilization mission in the Central African Republic, I came across a report yesterday, I guess it was, claiming that 50% of the UN force is Corona positive, in a situation where this country is heading for very much contested, widely contested elections. So it is clear that the number of security threats, both traditional and non-traditional, have increased over the last decade. This has necessitated certain adaptations in terms of ad hoc and other mechanisms. And importantly, and we haven't touched upon that, none of those have addressed the disconnect that we can see between the AU and the African people, or the RECs and their people. There's huge potential to bring in ordinary people in peace building and mediation and early warning. It is being done in ECOWAS with regard to conflict prevention, early warning. IGAD and the East African Community are following this one now. There's a huge potential in organizations such as FemWise Africa to bring in ordinary people into track 1, 2, 3 mediation processes and the like. And I guess part of the debate that we need to have is really on how to improve on these mechanisms that could work across the disconnect that we still have.
Thank you very much, Ulf. And with that round of questions from the chat, I would like to close this chat question round and give back to Uli.
Thank you very much, Philipp, for these interesting questions. We are almost coming to an end of this panel, but before we close, I would like to ask each of the panelists to maybe give us a 1-minute closing statement. Ladies first, Katharina, please.
This is hard because the issue itself is very complex, and maybe this is going to be the 1-minute closing statement for me, that if you go back the last 1.5 hours, we have touched upon a lot of important issues, and we cannot solve or address these things in 1 minute, and we need to take more time to think about what to do and how to go forward. That would be my plea.
Thank you, Katharina. Mr. Aynte, please, could I have your short statement for the closure?
Sure, thank you. And I'll be very brief, and I'll just say that for the African Union has made tremendous progress over the past decade in trying to reform its overall strategies and thinking, especially as it relates to collective security architecture. But when it comes to implementing that and translating that into practically on the ground, I think we are still facing big challenges as it relates to financing those architectures and as it relates to a common value system. So I would advocate for trying for better thinking on those two areas so that African countries can hold each other accountable onto the shared value system that can align the interests of the countries, but also ensure that narrow geostrategic interests by individual countries are not advanced through the collective security system. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdi, Aynte. And last but not least, Professor Engel, please.
The 1-minute conclusion is the most difficult one. I do agree, of course, with everything that has been said already. It's an incremental process of institutionalizing and professionalizing solutions, although increasingly we may be facing coalitions of the willing and the able to take the lead in all areas.
Okay, thank you very much for those short statements. I know it's not easy to conclude on that, but I think finally I will be my task to conclude here, because we have also almost come to an end. What I took from this panel is that definitely we need to appreciate the ABSA framework as a kind of a respectable project of African states, of collective security mechanism with the aim to take responsibility of their own security. As this collective security arrangement that ABSA wants to be, it faces a lot of challenges, especially through new threats, but also through, I'd say, politics and national interests. The trend is also similar, and we shouldn't forget that, to what is happening on many other continents. There is a turn-away or turning a blind eye on multilateralism, sometimes and more often. I think it's also observable in other regions. Especially when it comes to intervening in conflicts, and those coalitions of the willing ad hoc coalitions are more and more seen. Still, APSA wants to be relevant on the continent, and it needs to find a consensus between the states and also coming together a synthesis of the African peace and security architecture on the one side, but also on the African governance architecture, which means self-regulation, self-reporting kind of mechanisms. But also, most importantly, I think, and that is a big challenge I see, is Africa or African states need to put their money where their mouth is. We need to have increased funding, especially as like mechanism of the African standby force. If the money is not there, if it's not available, it's very unlikely that we will see employable African standby force. While these ad hoc coalition also represent kind of a quick and robust alternatives or intervention forces, they can also not substitute multilateral and multifaceted stabilizations or peace-building missions. They might be, for some instances, good as a first response. Also, what is obvious, there's a lack of legitimization. I mean, we've also recently, I've heard about in Mali that like ECOWAS is losing less and less credibility within the Malian population, for instance, which was a surprise to me somehow. And yeah, also those coalitions are also more and more subject to narrow national interest. We've heard that from Abdi Aynte in the case of the Horn of Africa, especially where the interests of the neighboring countries definitely do not align. So APSA needs to adapt to new realities, and it needs to especially deal more proactively with the new reality and the new security threats. We've also heard there are some small advances being made in the field of mediation already. We've seen that in some of the coups d'etats that have been taking place also. So it's something also to develop further, and it's relatively not too expensive. So it remains to be seen if the announced reform process, as mandated by the heads of Assembly of States in July 2016, will be able to address those challenges faced by APSA. We've come to the end of our panel, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to express my gratitude to our panelists, Dr. Döring, Mr. Aynte, Professor Engel, also to, especially to Christoph Matschie for this very thought-provoking opening statement. And last but not least, thank you for attending, for all the audience out there, and please stay in good health. Thank you very much.